we can only go so far advocating for ourselves, especially if, we've maybe been in the past, maybe we're a little bit like new after our diagnosis, if we're like new to like the company, asking the question and like giving us the space to advocate for ourselves and actually, actually listening and actioning it is possibly one of the best things that you can do for us.
Hi and welcome to the show. I'm Johnny Campbell, CEO and co-founder of SocialTalent. And this week we're speaking with Parul Singh. We're going to be talking about neurodiversity in the workplace. And I'm absolutely thrilled to have Parul here to join me. Parul, you're welcome to the show. I wonder if you could introduce yourself to our audience, tell us a little bit about yourself, maybe your professional background, personal background, and start with where are you joining us from today?
Yeah, of course. Thank you so much for having me, Johnny. So, I'm actually currently in the middle of our career break. So, I actually left my last job about 2 weeks ago at the time of recording. So, my last role that I was doing, I was working in recruitment marketing and candidate attraction for a tech consultancy. And before that, I was a tech recruiter for about 5 years. And also I run a lot of sort of like communities. I'm a community manager for the talent community. I run one of like my own meetup groups. I'm a woman of color. I'm neurodivergent. So a lot of my career has also been kind of like focused around like advocating and championing for like minority groups in the workplace. Outside of work, well, some people might be able to tell from my accent. I'm originally from Liverpool. I'm a Red, in case anybody's wondering. But I've lived in Manchester for about 10 years, did uni here, loved it so much, decided to probably never leave. So yeah, that's a little bit about me, and thank you so much for having me on today.
Oh, Parul, it's such a pleasure to have you on, and I'm dying to dig in and understand a little bit about you, your background, and the wider kind of topic of neurodiversity. I wonder, could you start by explaining to our audience, for those who perhaps aren't familiar with some of the terms and language, what is neurodiversity? What does it typically cover? You mentioned you're neurodivergent. You didn't say you're neurodiverse.
Mm,
So maybe talk about some of those
mm.
terms as well, and what just to get everyone comfortable with the language and the terminology.
Yeah, of course. Before I go into that as well, I know that there tends to be quite a lot of like dialogue on social media around, kind of like using like the right language and sort of, this is right and this is wrong. I'm very much of, my viewpoint is that, if people are like trying to understand, it doesn't really matter if, there's maybe interchangeable words that are actually sort of like used, but anybody making an effort to, try and understand like the difference, like I think that is great just before I start. So I guess starting with like neurodiversity. So I guess like you could maybe draw a parallel with sort of like, like biodiversity. Like biodiversity is like the variations within like a biological ecosystem. Similarly, neurodiversity is like the infinite variations of the human brain within like the human species. So linking to that, if you're describing something as neurodiverse, that is generally a group. So imagine like a team of people who have neurodivergent conditions, don't have neurodivergent conditions, that would be described as a neurodiverse group or a neurodiverse collective. And then neurodivergent is what we use to describe an individual. So myself, I'm neurodivergent. I have a neurodivergent condition, ADHD. I'm also autistic. And then the final one would be neurotypical. So in the literal sense, that would mean, neuro meaning brain and then typical meaning, normal. Though arguably, I would say that there's, maybe no such thing as sort of like a normal brain. But in this context, it means somebody without a neurodivergent condition. And something which is slightly different from those sorts of like definitions, which is something which I'm still a little bit new to. I'm still learning as I go. But there is also what's called identity first language, and then like person first language. So identity first would be I am an autistic person as opposed to a person with autism, and this generally goes down to kind of like a person's individual preference. I do know that a lot of like the autistic community do prefer kind of like the identity, first kind of like language. It's something which is like innate, like it's like a part of you. It's not like, like a disease or like an infection or anything that like you have. It's just sort of like who you are. So that's a little rundown of the kind of like definitions.
And when people talk about neurodiversity, you mentioned autism, for example, there. What are
Yeah.
some of the other different divergent brain types that are out there that people might come across? Like, because I imagine we're not just talking about somebody who has autism or somebody who has
Yeah.
ADHD, the two I mentioned earlier. There are many different types of brain types that might be covered under that broader spectrum of diversity that we mentioned.
Yeah. Yeah, of course. So I would say probably the most commonly known ones would be ADHD. So a common misconception is that ADHD and ADD are actually different things, but actually it was just kind of like the language which was changed and they added the H in there as well. So that actually does cover like both, so they're actually the same thing. And then also ASD, which is autism spectrum disorder, which we mentioned, and dyslexia as well as probably kind of like the more sort of like commonly known ones. And there is also like dyspraxia and like Tourette's as well. So the whole umbrella of like neurodivergent conditions actually does cover quite a lot. But a really important differentiating factor to make is that they're not mental health conditions and they are actually completely like separate. So everything that we're talking about here, they are neurodevelopmental conditions. However, there is like a high incidence of mental health conditions in neurodivergent people, which often comes as a result of like the challenges that are faced by living in like a society that is generally built for like neurotypicals. So high recurrences of like depression, anxiety, eating disorders, etc.
And thank you for that kind of broad coverage. And the language point is interesting, right? I'm ADHD. I have four kids, one who has dyspraxia and is autistic as well. And I've had to grapple with the language differences. So my wife has worked with children with autism for 20 odd years. And I would have always said person with autism, as I thought that was more respectful. And then, as I engage more with that community and look at how do I describe my son's brain types, it just doesn't feel right to
Mm.
me. As again, it's a personal
Yeah,
preference to say with
yeah.
autism, because it's not an affliction that you're going to ever be without. It's just the way your brain works. And I had a wonderful
Yeah.
conversation with my three youngest boys in the car a couple of weeks ago. We were
Mm.
talking about brain types. And I
Mm.
guess the way I see it, I don't know if you're the same, Parallel, I think you are, is that we always have a different brain type, a predisposition to certain ways of thinking. I
Mm.
described to my kids that my brain type just doesn't really sit still. I need to be busy. I
Yeah.
need to constantly do stuff. That's just the way my brain type works. I talked about my son's dyspraxia, that his brain type just finds it difficult to coordinate some of his limbs and hands or in fine motor skills.
Mm.
Just his brain doesn't quite focus the way, let's say, his brother does. Our autism
Yeah.
express itself in a very wide manners. We have some kids who are nonverbal, and then
Yeah.
other kids who are, barely noticeable for this difference, but perhaps they are struggle with social
Mm.
situations, or they might have a particular passion about something. That passion could be mathematics, it could be football, it could be whatever. That
Yeah.
around us in the world today, we have all these different brain types, and it's just
Mm.
recognizing that whatever our brain type is isn't necessarily what everybody else has. And I think that's the thing, that as you grow up as a kid, you just think everyone thinks the same way as you. When you become
Yeah.
an adult, you go, oh, our brains just work differently. I'm not the same as everybody else. They're not the same as me. Is that kind of how you see it as well?
Yeah, yeah, 100%. I think the first thing that you mentioned there is that, like, it is like a spectrum. So every neurodivergent person is going to be like potentially different from another one. But even like within that is like day to day. Sometimes it's like situational based as well. There is research going on that, looking into like how menopause affects women and
Mm.
like ADHD. There's actually quite a lot of women. I'm actually in like a WhatsApp group chat for like ADHD women, and a lot of them are talking about only being diagnosed after having children because of how like their hormones actually changed and
Wow.
how it actually became like evident. So even for like an individual, it can really fluctuate depending on like the stage of life and like the situation that you are actually in. And then the other thing which you mentioned there about how like it's just such a beautiful thing that like the world is just made up of like so many brilliant kinds of like different minds. And like a phrase that I heard in a talk and like just really stuck with me is that like, what happens when great minds don't think alike? Because that phrase that we always say, isn't it, is like, great minds think alike. But what about kind of like the inverse? And it's really interesting. And I'm happy to sort of like link this study in the description if anybody wants to read it. But like researchers have found that like dyslexic people were actually crucial for the survival of the human species. And they use this evolutionary theory called complementary cognition, which is basically, in simple terms, it means like the sum of our parts. So like we need all kinds of brains to a survive as a species, but also to thrive. And I think that really translates in the workplace as well. The more that like it's like that, what is it, like the yellow car theory, like when you see a yellow car and then you'll just see like all of the yellow cars. So the more that like you kind of like open your mind to, neurodiversity in like the workplace, like you'll start to spot things. And the more that you kind of like become conscious of them, and then making sure that like it's an environment where like everybody can thrive. And I think really like, hammering home that like complementary cognition sort of like concept. I think that's really big for me. I know we're going to go into that a little bit like later, but yeah, I think that just relates really well to what you said, is that all the different ways of like thinking, but it's having like the empathy as well. Because, when I was younger and I didn't understand about it, like, I would get a little bit frustrated at people because I'm like, you're not getting it. Or, I'll admit I was probably quite, a little bit, aggy about, children being really loud and disruptive and, in sort of like public. And now that I understand it, it's actually just given me the empathy to think that like, I don't know, but like they could be autistic, like they could be having a meltdown, they could be nonverbal, they might not be able to tell their parents like how exactly they're feeling. And I think not just, the positive impact that it's had on me in terms of like my career in the workplace, but I think just the understanding outside of work as well has just been like really big for me.
I love that term empathy. I think empathy is the theme I want to take for this talk, because I think that's what we're hoping to achieve from this, is to give everyone listening that ability to empathize more with everybody around them, right? To all these different brain
Yeah.
types and all these different wonderful people in the workplace. Talk to me about your
Yeah.
particular experience, Parul, because your my understanding is your diagnosis of ADHD was later in life, and your diagnosis of ASD was even more recent. Walk me through what ADHD and ADSD mean for you individually. As you know, as you said
Mm.
earlier on, it is different. There's a wide spectrum. Not every ADHD person or ASD person is the same. So, how does it express itself for you? And maybe tell us
Mm.
about receiving the diagnosis and also what it meant for you.
Yeah, definitely. So I was diagnosed with inattentive type ADHD. So there are actually three different types. So inattentive is kind of, the more like internalized kind of like symptoms. And then the kind of opposite of that is like the hyperactive impulsive type, which you kind of, is stereotyped for like the, disruptive boys in sort of like the classroom. And then there is also like a combined type as well. So I do have the hyperactivity, but a lot of it is kind of like in my brain. I've always like my brain has always been going like a million miles an hour. I've really struggled with sort of like the emotional dysregulation side of things, which means that, I might not kind of like react to a sort of like situation without, I may react without actually like thinking about it. My time management was always like really, really poor in school. I couldn't pay attention to things that I wasn't actually interested in. And what's quite interesting, I've just sort of like pulled it up here as well, just to maybe actually read you some actual snippets from like my school reports. One of them says her position at the front of the class has made a difference to her concentration. Parallel deems some subjects to warrant her attention more than others. She is very smart, but she distracts herself and sort of like other people. So, school was a real struggle. And then going into like university where like you don't have to go to lectures if you don't want to, like nobody is going to tell you off, nobody's taking attendance. And my God, when it came to exam period, I was cramming for like the entire month before it and like burning myself out like completely. So that was kind of like my earlier life. And then it was only kind of like going into the workplace, and the point where the sort of like had the light bulb moment was it was by chance actually. I didn't know a lot about ADHD, and I went to this sort of like virtual talk. It was a tech one. It was during COVID time, so and there was a lady called Rachel Morgan Trimmer who the other ones were technical talks. She was talking about neurodiversity, so I was like, okay, interesting. And then when she's kind of started talking about some of the characteristics, I was like, oh my God, that's me. Next morning, requested to the GP, and then got my diagnosis just like a few months later. But something which I've kind of come to realize with kind of my own journey with that, and probably similar to quite a lot of other people, is that you're often diagnosed based on like how much you like inconvenience other people. So if you internalize a lot of your symptoms, and because a kid in the back of the class who's maybe, dozing off or doodling instead of paying attention is a lot less disruptive than somebody who will physically not sit in their seat and they're like shouting things and, being really rude and being, openly like distracting. And then the other element of it is like the masking aspect. And I'm not saying that like this is just sort of like women and like girls, because it can definitely impact like boys as well. But I think from like a young age, like we're brought up as like girls to like behave in a certain way and like have certain kind of like mannerisms, and you're taught that like, it's the opposite of kind of, boys will be boys, like sometimes is that like, you have to be quiet, like you have to be like polite, remember like your manners and all those sorts of things. And it gets ingrained in you. So you kind of like start to naturally mask at
Mm.
sort of like such a young age. And also just maybe for context, people who are not kind of like sure what like masking is, it's basically kind of like, animals in the wild, like camouflaging. It's what you will do as like a survival skill. So, examples of like how I mask as well is I used to be an internal recruiter and I'd be doing the first stage interviews. I would try really, really hard to make sure that it's not really obvious that I'm taking notes, because I want the person to make sure that, I'm paying attention, and then making sure that like I'm staring right at the camera, because like retaining eye contact can sometimes be like really difficult for me. Or when we're doing in-person training sessions is, trying not to like fidget as well. But like, as like time passes, it becomes harder. And, I know people will be listening to this in an audio sort of aspect, but Johnny, you'll be able to see right now in my hands, I've got my little twisty fidget toy because it soothes me. And like, I really need to be able to do that to sort of like concentrate. So I think because I was very good at masking, um, just pretty much like flew under the radar. But like that diagnosis was like really like a turning point in my life. Like my journey since then has been one of like self compassion. Because there's a like you can't discipline or autistic ADHD traits out of somebody. You just can't, no matter how much you try. Um, so it's given myself the self compassion that this is why I can't do this, and maybe I need to work out a different way to like approach it, because I don't think it gives me like a free pass to speak to somebody a certain way, or not really get sort of like the work done, but just a little bit of like a different approach. So I would say like I'm a very different person now than I probably was about like 3 years ago.
And so looking at you know, your experience in the workplace and then what you've learned from
Mm.
others in different communities who perhaps share some of those traits, what are some of the perhaps unexpected, perhaps obstacles or challenges you faced that perhaps other people with ASD or ADHD are likely to face that maybe most people aren't aware of, that they would never even think of? What are some of those challenges that come up in the workplace? You've shared some of them, the
Mm.
fidgeting, the trying to concentrate, the eye contact, but maybe are there
Mm.
more general observations you've made about yourself and others that you can share?
Um, I think one of them, which I only kind of realized, around the time that, the penny dropped, that I was also autistic, which kind of only happened about 2.5 years after, like my ADHD diagnosis. And I am self-diagnosed autistic, like at this stage. I'm like, want to be really, really open about that. Because I do believe, I have to practice what I preach, and I do believe that a self-diagnosis is valid, because, diagnosis is not like accessible to a lot of people. Like the wait lists in the NHS are very, very long, and a private diagnosis costs a lot of money. And, I'm on a career break at the moment, so I probably need to be a little bit more kind of like sensible with that. Um, so I think a lot of it kind of more fell into place, with the kind of like autistic side of things. And like one of them is the like taking things like quite literally and like being quite like direct with things. And a lot of autistic people might not like we sometimes don't really see hierarchies the same way as like other people actually see them. So, which is a very interesting kind of less known part of it. So when you don't see like the hierarchies as much, and then also like you like to understand a lot about like the why, that can sometimes come across as like, questioning somebody, especially sort of like a manager. But like for me to kind of like be able to, if somebody asks me to do something, I always do it. But if I understand sort of like why and like where this fits into sort of like the bigger picture, it makes it a lot easier for me. But sometimes for people that, it can be seen as questioning their like authority or like something else, but it just kind of, a lot of it sort of like comes from quite, like a genuine and like authentic place. Like I don't, necessarily kind of like mean it in that way. I think one of the other areas I probably would say is like trying to kind of like find that middle ground within a team with different neurotypes. Because again, like there might be other neurodivergent people within a team. People might have the same conditions as me, but even have like different kinds of like communication preferences. And I think that was kind of like a really interesting thing to, the last team that I was working in, like, they were really good and like really understanding. But, there was like, I think about like 15 of us by the time that I actually left. And most of us are actually like, we're a remote first company. And I think being remote actually poses a lot of like challenges, because I think when somebody's kind of like struggling with something, it's sort of like a lot harder to tell. So something which I try to kind of like start getting people to like use a little bit more is like a sort of like a working with me manual. Have you like heard of one of those before?
No, tell me more.
So I think it was, it was over sort of like Monzo's kind of like social media and LinkedIn a few years ago. I think it kind of went semi-viral, but they basically have like a bit of like a document, and
Mm,
people fill it in themselves, and it says kind of like what their communication preferences are, what they need to kind of like work to the best of their like ability, how to give them like feedback, etc. And now there are actually like online tools to do that, and I think having something like that in a team, maybe a newly formed team dynamic where there's perhaps like new team members and people are working really remotely. I think not for, just for neurodivergent people, remember, like people whose, kind of first language isn't like English, people who come from like a different country. So like the cultural kind of like norms and expectations are a little bit different. Somebody who has like anxiety. So I think that's actually a really simple thing to like approach and tackle in like the workplace if you want to make it a little bit more and more inclusive. And that's something that I've probably like experienced in sort of quite a really positive light as well.
I love that. Actually, I recall one of our team leaders doing that with her team, and they kept an online document, and every new team member would fill it out, and they'd be able to see their colleagues,
Mm,
and it was
yeah,
all those things such as communication preferences, styles, even down to
yeah,
how I prefer to be contacted. Do I prefer Slack,
yeah,
email, text? My working hours that I'm comfortable with, why I'm not comfortable with, let's say 9 to 10 a.m. What I'm doing,
yeah,
I like social situations. I don't like social situations. All those different things. And having it written
mm,
down, to your point, is wonderful because it's freeing when you're the team member coming
mm,
in. You don't have to figure this stuff out from over months and make mistakes or maybe embarrass
mm.
yourself or somebody else. It's just there at the open. I love that. What other advice would you have for anyone listening here who, well, maybe let's take two different types. Let's talk about anyone listening who suspects that they might be neurodivergent, and then somebody who doesn't believe they're neurodivergent but believes they might work with somebody or might have someone on their team
Mm,
who's neurodivergent. So maybe take those two use cases. For the first person, you
mm,
mentioned long waiting lists in the UK. It's the same in Ireland. I think it's the same in most places.
mm.
So if someone is sitting here thinking, I recognize some of those traits in me, gosh, maybe I'm neurodivergent. What advice would you give somebody who's thinking that?
I think it's maybe a little bit, I understand it might be a little bit more difficult for people to approach it if they are kind of like self-diagnosed. Um, I am a little bit more kind of like confident about it, but in reality, a medical diagnosis does kind of like give you that confirmation and a little bit of sort of like validation. So, firstly, I can understand that there may be anxiety for people who don't yet have that kind of like medical diagnosis. And I think the very first kind of like step is people are pondering, should I disclose or should I not disclose? And I think that is really the age old question. I was actually just talking to a friend this week who is applying for and interviewing for jobs. And they are also neurodivergent. And they were saying, like, should I disclose? Like, should I ask for like the reasonable adjustments? And what I said to them is especially sort of at interview and application stage, like unfortunately, there is a little bit more kind of like risk on the line, as opposed to sort of like in the workplace. But what I said to them is if you're worried about not disclosing because of, people seeing you differently or potential, like discrimination, whether it's, intentional, unintentional, subconsciously, consciously, um, people may well do it anyway because they like,
Mm,
depending on how well you can mask, like you can't always hide it. So if you're not disclosing because of fear of discrimination, there's always sort of like a risk for that anyway. And again, for me, like personally, I would treat disclosures like a bit of like a litmus test for companies anyway. I appreciate that, that is a massive privilege to say that like I will disclose at application stage. Not a lot of people can necessarily afford that sort of like privilege, dependent on, whether they've been made like redundant, like they really need a job, and depends on like the demand of your skill set, etc. But for me, like if a company doesn't really respond well to that at that stage, I would rather know then than kind of like go through the process, get into the company, and then disclose, and you're like, oh no, this was a really sort of like bad idea. And generally, what I find as well is, if you're wondering how, you can't get the support that you need, through like reasonable adjustments without the sort of like disclosure. You can maybe do it a little bit more kind of like in a mysterious way that, oh, I would really like to have the actions in writing after like the meeting. People might be less likely to take it a bit seriously. Do you know what I mean? Because it is a legal requirement in
Mm.
most countries. So I don't know where kind of the listeners are from, but in the UK, neurodivergent people, the majority are protected by the Equality Act. It is a protected characteristic. So if you disclose, you have like the legal protection. Not saying that that is like sort of like foolproof, but there are massive kind of like financial repercussions for companies. Employment tribunals surrounding neurodivergent conditions have like sharply increased over sort of like the past few years. I can't recall the exact stat. I think it's maybe in like the 20% sort of like mark actually. So I think it's absolutely worth it. And then also it takes that weight off your shoulders for like not feeling like you have to like mask and starting to get a little bit like comfortable. And it is a little bit uncomfortable to sort of like begin with. My unmasking happened over like a period of like several years. Like it doesn't happen in a month or sort of like six
Mm.
months, but being able to get through the day without like trying to like appear inverted commas normal is just so much more like liberating. And I just find that like all of the things that you worry that people won't like you for, some people will love you even more for that actually. And a lot of people really, they genuinely want to do the right thing. Sometimes they don't know how to sort of like approach the conversation or sort of like support. But just going into it with like a little bit of like an open mind, because my experience has generally been like really, really positive. And I hope that other people would also have a similar experience as well. But it's opening up in the first place, I think.
For people who perhaps have a physical disability, their colleagues are literally physically more aware of it. Somebody's blind or deaf, you're going to be more heightened to, turn on closed captions, to do these different things. Someone who's
Mm.
neurodivergent, you know, almost by definition, you're not going to see anything. So if you're listening to this podcast and you're thinking, maybe someone in my team is neurodivergent, maybe someone who works for me, maybe my boss. What are some of the things that you would recommend people can consider and do? You mentioned briefly there, note taking, for example. Talk me through some of
Mm.
these things that are less obvious to somebody who's neurotypical that maybe you could recommend that they start thinking about that could help a more neurodivergent team.
Yeah, I think the communication preferences is a really big one. And the good thing about that is that you don't have to make it like a big thing, because some people might feel a little bit uncomfortable with being like, oh, because of your ADHD, like how can we sort of like do that? So it just can approach it in a little bit more sort of like a sensitive like manner, and not always kind of like waiting for that person to like the neurodivergent person to come to you in the team saying that like
Mm.
I'm maybe having a problem with this. I'll give an example of my line manager in my last company when I worked in the recruitment role. So I had joined that team. It was my first internal role, and I come from a very small company as well. And I've been there for about a month, and we were having a one-to-one. And she said, I'm not sure, maybe the team meeting is maybe, not as sort of like effective. Maybe it's not like working for you like as well. I noticed that, perhaps you're struggling to sort of like pay attention a little bit. Is there anything that we could do to maybe, improve it a little bit for you? I was like, oh, wow. Because, if somebody's a month into a job, you don't want to be the person going in being like, hi, like, can we just, this is not working for me. Can we change this whole process? A lot of people are not comfortable advocating for
Mm.
themselves for that level. So the first thing, her just asking me, firstly noticing, then asking, and me feeling like I had a safe space to be really honest, I think was the first key bit. and then actually actioning what I suggested. So I said my concentration is usually a lot better in the morning. I'm not saying put the meeting in at the crack of dawn. Nobody wants a 9 a.m. meeting a lot of the times. But maybe, if it was like before lunch, that would potentially like really help because I kind of go down a slippery slope throughout the day. And she said, yeah, that's absolutely fine. And then the other thing that I said is like the sort of structure of like the meeting. And we kind of flipped the way that sort of like we did things and won't go into like the details. And then on the agenda, we actually broke down how many minutes is going to be spent on each of kind of like the 2, 3 sections. So it followed like a really nice format. So instead of one person talking for like almost like half of the meeting in like the beginning, we were all giving our updates in like the beginning. So it was a little bit more sort of like variety, a little bit more kind of like engaging. And actually, as a result, it reduced the meeting time from like an hour to like 30 to 45 minutes because it ended up being like more efficient that way. So it didn't just benefit me, but it also benefited like other people in the team. So I guess kind of like the main thing that I want people to take away from that story is that like we can only go so far advocating for ourselves, especially if we've maybe been bent in the past, maybe we were a little bit like new after our diagnosis, if we're like new to like the company, asking the question and like giving us the space to advocate for ourselves and actually listening and actioning it is possibly one of the best things that you can do for us.
I love that. Two of our speakers, Jason and Lyndon, refer to this as the cultivation mindset and leadership. Sounds like your former leader in that recruitment company had this, where you recognize that everybody turns up to work wanting to succeed. Nobody wants to fail. And so therefore, when
Yeah.
you observe somebody who is not,
Mm,
coping or struggling, something's in their way or they're not getting enough of something. And that's
mm,
the idea of the cultivation
yeah.
mindset, is that just like a seed wants to grow, everybody wants to
Mm,
succeed, and therefore, if they're not succeeding, it's not their fault.
mm,
It's that they're not getting something, or something's in their way. There's an obstacle. I think uh,
mm,
having that mindset as a leader is just so important, to be empathetic, to have
mm,
that empathy towards others. To go, hang on a second, I'm just going to not sitting here saying Parul is not paying attention. She doesn't like this job. She wants to
mm,
be disruptive. Of course, she doesn't. Something's
mm.
happening that's resulting in
Yeah.
somebody just acting in a way that seems disruptive. What is it? It must be something that she's not getting, or it's in her way. Let's see if I can help that. That's my job as the manager, is to try and help that person, help everyone in the
Yeah.
team in that way.
Yeah, I think a lot of that kind of comes down to like the perception of like neurodivergence, I think in like general. And I think just probably like a really kind of like current topic at the moment is like the representation of neurodivergent conditions in the media. So recently, which I did a post about earlier this week, was like an article by like the Daily Mail, which had basically like cherry picked things from like a study to kind of like fit the narrative. And it was basically saying that like research has shown that like, increased screen time, on like phones, laptops, etc., linked to higher risk of ADHD. Basically like implying that being on your phone too much can actually sort of like cause it. And then there's like others where, there's been, politicians in like our like country as well, like saying at, like the political conferences, etc., that like it's a result of like bad parenting, that it's like trendy that everybody just sort of they want a diagnosis, like they want special treatment, they want benefits, they want they just want like an excuse to sort of like get out of it. And like a lot of people are smart enough to kind of like see beyond that. But if you kind of like consciously sort of like have this sort of like information that you're like reading, and it can potentially like influence, that like we are all inherently biased as sort of like humans. And I think what you said earlier about how like, with physical disabilities being visible, but like, neurodivergent conditions not sort of being like as sort of like visible, they are less kind of like understood. I think we made great progress over the last few years, but I think those sort of like, perceptions, and there's actually a study which was done that like 50% of people said that they would be uncomfortable employing somebody with at least one neurodivergent condition. There was another one done which found, and that one was granted a fairly small sort of sample size, but that autistic people were less likable to neurotypical people, as compared to sort of like the like control group, because it's how like we don't like present and interact in like a social way. It can come across as like rude. It can come across as like direct. It can come across as flaky. I've really struggled with friendships as well, to be honest. Like I find it really hard to sort of like maintain that kind of like that sort of like communication. Like I found it very difficult sort of like throughout my life. And I think changing that sort of like perception as like how we see it, and that it's like it's beyond, just the symptoms or like the traits of like a condition, that this is part of somebody, it's part of like the way that they actually like think. There isn't anything wrong with them. It's not like a deficit, and it can bring so many strengths to like the workplace. And like I work in the tech sector, and I've seen a lot of companies who are kind of, not just tolerating but really embracing neurodiversity in the workplace. Like they are thriving. They have, higher employee satisfaction, higher retention rates, more neurodivergent people getting promoted into leadership skills, which is like a massive barrier for us. More innovative teams. So like tech companies want to build the best products. So
Mm.
inevitably, it's actually going to do that. So I know that like, tech is probably, I appreciate probably in a little bit of an echo chamber like sometimes. But I think generally speaking, like we're making a lot of like good progress. But I think that's the first thing to tackle. It's the perception and like the stereotypes. And sometimes I've even had to like challenge my own internalized ableism as well. And because you think that, okay, well, I don't struggle with this, that's not a problem for me. I don't demonstrate those sorts of like traits. But like other people might. So even neurodivergent people can also have those like perceptions about each other. And I'll be really honest about that. But it takes work.
I love that. The work is worth doing. You mentioned something there about friendships that just struck with me. A good friend of mine, he's 52. Over Christmas, he shared with me that he received his ASD diagnosis at 52. And one of the things
Wow.
that it gave him was, this is a friend who, amongst a group of us lads, we were, he would just never get in touch. And, we used to
Mm,
kind of joke, but we were kind of annoyed that, he just never ring you. He'd never organize lunch or to go to the cinema or whatever. And we were kind of going, we always have to make the effort. Like he just never makes the effort. And,
mm,
I persevered. But then he shared with me, he said, because I've learned that my autism, he goes, I don't,
mm,
he goes, this was said to me when I received my diagnosis. I goes, I never thought that was a problem. I didn't know you're meant to follow up with people, keep in touch when you haven't a actual reason to be in touch. He goes, I never knew that was a thing. Because I've been told now with my autism that other people, neurotypical people, keep in touch with each other. They message, they check in. He goes, I don't do that. And
mm,
I've realized I've lost friends. And he declared it to us.
mm,
And it was brilliant because it just changed everything. We're like,
mm,
okay, that's just the way his brain works. He's not a bad person. We were holding
mm,
himself to the standards we felt
mm,
everyone had to hold themselves to. And when he was able to share that his brain works differently and he loves us as friends and still wants to spend as much time with us, it's just that it requires an immense amount of deliberate effort for him to do that versus, let's say, a
mm,
neurotypical person. Sharing that with somebody
yeah,
and knowing that about yourself can be just so liberating, right? And for your friends. And I think back to the empathy
mm,
piece, we constantly just see the world the way we experience it, and we assume others see it the same way, they think the same way, they act the same way, they have the same feelings about things.
yeah,
I think the big lesson for me in all of this is to realize that we are, great minds do not think alike, to your point, Parul. The beauty is that great
mm,
minds think completely differently, and they're all still great
mhm.
and can work in one workforce. Parul, I would have to thank you so much for your time. I know you do a lot of work in this space. You deliver talks, you deliver training with folks. If people want to reach out to you and contact you, what's the best way to reach out to you?
Best way to reach out to me would be through LinkedIn. More than happy to hear from anybody who has any questions off the back of like anything that like I've said. I have a newsletter, which is Dopamine Diaries on my LinkedIn as well, which is all about kind of like neurodiversity in the workspace. I can also pop my email if you want to, if people don't have LinkedIn and they want to get in touch. So, yeah, thank you so much for having me today, Johnny, and I've really enjoyed recording this podcast.
I will include all those details in the show notes. And thank you for listening. And if you have any questions or concerns around neurodiversity and you want to ask any questions or want to be put in touch with Parul or anybody else on our team or anyone else in our community, please do reach out to us in the show. Until next time, thanks for listening.